My last shift. It was June the 14th, 1950, and I was blissfully unaware that this would be my last day down the mine. I was on afternoon shift, a shift I disliked very much as all I did was sleep and work. My summer holidays were fast approaching, so I had loftier things on my mind than work. At this time, I was driving in the rock tunnels, working 6-hour shifts. In the 24-hour day, 2 shifts were drilling and dynamiting rounds, and the other 2 were mucking it up. This fateful day, I arrived at the bathhouse to be told that the rounds had not been drilled because of compressed air problems, and the drillers were just going in. I could pull coal on the east side if I wished to work my shift. It was like any other afternoon. I dropped my hanger and basket, took off my street clothes, and put on my work clothes. Kidding around with some of my coworkers, I made my way up to the lamp cabin to get a lamp attached to a battery. Then I picked up my metal number tab to fix it to my battery buckle. By then it was time to go, so I grabbed my lunch pail, joined some buddies, and headed out. To get down the east side, we had to cross the Tipple Bridge, climb a hill, and then head down the slope. Lloyd Engley, the other driver that night, was pulling from the inside raises, and I was loaded from the first chute, the pillar chute, where all the pillar coal comes down. The most money was made in the pillars, but it was also the most dangerous place to work. Bill Langer was my chute loader and bucker. We loaded 5 cars of coal, dropped them down in the parting, and pulled 5 empties in. We had loaded about 2.5 more when suddenly the coal stopped. It seemed the pillar was not working. We waited for quite some time, but still no coal. "I think I'll go up and see what the trouble is," Bill said. "See you later," I replied. I was still waiting for coal when Roy Carr, the fire boss, came along. He was in a jovial mood as this was his last shift before moving to a new job away from the Cadman mines. He said something like, "Can't make money this way, young fellow. Better get up and check it out." I told him Bill Langer had just gone up a while before and had not yet returned. Just as Roy was heading up the raise, Windy Shearer burst into the panel. "Smitty, whose contract are you on? We need the dynamite right away." I told him the dynamite was in the middle of the empties. Normally, the empties would have been loaded with the dynamite in each of the rock tunnels by this time. Not knowing how long it was going to take to get the coal caving, I disconnected the horse and went out of the parting. There, I pulled all the empties in front of the dynamite car up the track and then backed them onto the full track. After accomplishing this, I retrieved the dynamite car and headed for the rock tunnels. With the drillers satisfied in both the counter and main tunnel, I was returning to the panel when all of a sudden there was an awful change in air pressure. My ears had whistling in them, just as in a bump. A big bump. Before there was time to think, mud, water, and rock shuttered the entry panel into which we were about to turn. It filled the rock tunnel to the collars and came towards me and my horse. It reached my horse's chest before it stopped rising. I was grateful he was a quiet horse as he had backed me into the side of the tunnel. I was on top of his butt with my foot in the tail chain harness. Windy arrived just as I jumped down the tunnel and waded into the rock tunnel. I can't remember his first expression, but it meant, "This is a big one." He helped me get my horse out of the mud, and then he and Alex Matheson went back to the rock face to see if the compressed air was still going. It was. We still had air. We could do very little trapped in the rock tunnels, but we could go back through a rock counter, go through the pressure doors, and be on the other side of the panel. After a cave-in like this, we were concerned about methane gas in the return. We debated the situation, and Windy decided he could hold his breath long enough to run around to the pressure doors. We figured it could be done, so he attempted it and was successful. Over the settling mud, he informed us we could make it out also. On the other side there, to my surprise, sat Bill Langer. Was I ever relieved he had outrun the cave-in? Bill had a reputation for being able to run like a deer. In this instance, he must have. I believe my guardian angel saved me. The debris came down the same raise which I was loading all afternoon. The mud and rock came through it during the 20 to 25 minutes when I was taking the dynamite into the rock tunnels. Friends, children, and grandchildren have all asked the same questions. Were you afraid? Didn't it scare you? The truth is, it didn't scare me. The disaster happened so fast there was no time to get scared. They say there are no atheists in a foxhole, in a mine, or in any other life-threatening situation. We have a natural instinct to call a superior being to come to our aid. I was no exception. The strange part was, being relatively safe, I was now begging God for the safety of those in the panel. This was back when I thought the term being born again was silly. I guess most of the things you don't understand sound silly. The mud was beginning to settle down, and there was a driver, chute loader, and 8 more miners still in the panel, as well as the 4 pillar men and the fire boss. Once again, it was Windy yelling, "Come on, let's put planks on top of the mud and see if we can get into the panel." Then we got to the entrance and looked in. The mud level had dropped down to about a foot or so from the collars. While trying to get the planks farther and farther into the panel, we thought we saw reflections of lights inside. We called towards the glow, and finally we could hear answers to our calls, but there seemed to be a problem. We searched frantically for more planks. The mud had dropped about 2 feet now. At the entrance to the panel, the mud and water had spread out, and there was about 4 feet between the mud and the ceiling. At last I could see the first miners coming into the crosscut, pulling themselves over the mud with telephone lines. Those telephone lines were not very thick. The problem was that one miner was in a state of panic. They were trying to control him so he wouldn't break the wires, which were already overextended. Things were going slowly, too slowly for me. I was looking at Windy, Alec, and the others ahead of me as we were helping the miners out of the panel. This is my first chance to think clearly about the situation, and all I could think of was, if another load of rock comes down now, that's lights out for all of us. That was my first experience with a person in a state of panic. The sufferer is completely unreasonable, and his eyes are so wide and all white, a true look of terror. In the end, the trapped miners crawled or were dragged out of the panel one by one, with the sad exception of the 4-pillar man and the fire boss. No one expected those 5 to be found alive. I sometimes wonder if they set off a charge in an attempt to start the pillar working. We'll never know. H. Alstrom and John Kundrat, my childhood playmate's dad, were 2 of the miners who came out of the panel. John never said much except, "You okay, Jackie?" Sam Hudima, Alec Gregoric, and Bill Kotick were the other 3 that made it out. It was the wee hours in the morning. There was nothing else to do but try to grasp the enormity of it all. As no more could be done, I decided to leave the mine. Walking down to the conveyor dump and up the slope to the outside, I was in for another shock. We had had a cloudburst and nobody knew about it. It had washed out the mine bridge, the big tipple bridge, and half of a coal dump that had taken about 20 years to build. There were no warnings. Without our mine lamps, we could have walked into the river. In order to get to the washhouse, you had to shimmy across the viaduct that carried the steam pipes to the hoist room. Once across, the first person I met was a teenager, Peter Kosanovich. He asked me, "Jack, is my dad okay?" I told him I didn't know, which was true. But with the hundreds of tons of rock, mud, and timber that came down filling the tunnels, it would have taken a miracle for any of the men in the pillars to have survived. I didn't hold out any hope for them. John Kundrat was a bit ahead of me getting to the bathhouse. I greeted Helen Kundrat, who'd been waiting for her dad. As I continued into the bathhouse, I felt happy for Helen, but sad for Peter. I handed in my battery and number tag. You could hear the showers going, but the atmosphere was gloomy. After showering, I headed back to my hangar to dress in a bathhouse that was usually full of wisecracking, laughing, and ribbing miners. Tonight it was dead silent. There were a number of buddies and those concerned for family members. I guess more people would have been around if the roads and bridges hadn't been washed out and if other emergencies hadn't occurred due to the storm. When talking to Lloyd Engley earlier, he told me he had to put his chute loader on the back of his horse to get through the mud. It seemed his horse reared up to get over or around some debris and broke his chute loader's ribs on a collar. How this took place, I don't know. After a disaster, you were expected to go back down to the mine right away. They said if you didn't, you'd never go back again. A few days after the disaster, my holidays came up, and along with Mother, I headed to Vancouver. Little did I realize it would be the end of my Catamount experiences. In the early 30s, Bill was buried up to his neck in coal, and then he was burned in an explosion along with 7 timber pickers. In 1943, Dad lost his life, and now with my close call, Mother was very upset and asked my brother Ron to get me work in Vancouver. To my surprise, he got me a job in Burns Packing Plant. From there, I went to Exclusive Ambulance, then to the Shaughnessy Military Hospital. These experiences are a book in themselves. It was many years before I returned to Catamount, but the memories were always with me. After leaving Catamount, I met, courted, and married a registered nurse from the Vancouver General Hospital. I was blessed with a beautiful wife and 6 offspring. They became very familiar with Catamount through my stories. It wasn't until 1972 that I returned with my family to this beautiful area of surprises and shocks. It didn't disappoint me. There stood the mountain that I had faced for 20 years, with a quarter of its side missing. My family said I was tongue-tied for 3 days. What a shock. Right after telling my family that no matter what's changed, they can't change the mountains. Surprise! We camped at the Whitehorse River and explored Nels Bow's cabin, the Cardinal Divide, Hogs Bank, and the caves above the swings. I picked coal from the Mountain Park coal dumps and had a campfire of coal. The fire lasted all night. It was July, and the snow line came down to about 100 feet above our camp. I managed to get a wild rabbit and a fool hen for them to taste. I tried to get a feed of trout also, but it's not like it used to be. After 4 hours of fishing, we only caught 1 trout. Before I left Catamount the second time, I went back and stood on the ground where our log home had stood before it was bulldozed. I looked up the mountain with the wedge out of it. Across the tracks to the East Mine Coal Haul Road, the valley which once whined with the sounds of 3-ton Ford dump trucks carrying 10 to 12 sons of coal lay silent. No puff-puff of the shaft hoist. The humming moan of the fan which ventilated the mine and could be heard everywhere lay silenced forever. Then I looked down to where the tennis courts used to be, where Don and I played Kick the Can, Run Sheep Run, Steal the Stick, and other games with Helen Kundrat, Billy Lang, Illa Dodo, Aldo, and Joe Passamera. In the quiet, calm serenity of it all, in my imagination, I heard my mother call. Yes, I heard my mother call.